Welcome back to 7 Moons Astrology. I'm Sarah Kirby, and today we're talking about Joe Rogan's natal chart. Yes, the infamous Joe Rogan. We're talking everything from his basic personality to the astrology behind why he's having so much controversy in the media around his podcast today. So let's just get into it. So he's a Taurus rising, and I was actually really surprised about this because I would have actually guessed that he was an Aries rising just because of how he comes off. But then I thought about this a little bit more and it actually makes a lot of sense. And the reason why he embodies a lot of the Aries energy but isn't an Aries is of course because he's got Saturn in Aries, but we want to talk a little bit more about what we typically think of when we think of an Aries, and that's strength and self-assertion and leadership and confidence. And he's got all of those things, right? But some of the shadow elements of Aries are the inability to follow through and the starting of one thing and never finishing it, right? And the evolution of that energy, when we evolve that energy to its next stage, you get Taurus. Taurus has all of the, let's say, determination of Aries, but it's more persistent, it's more steadfast, and it's more patient. And so it never gives up, right? And it absolutely makes up for the inability to follow through that Aries typically combats with a tenacity that, you know, is probably the best of the entire zodiac. So he's a Taurus rising, and that actually makes his ruling planet Venus, which is placed in the 5th house. It was retrograde at the time of the at birth, and typically what this would suggest is definitely issues with self-esteem and appearance and self-worth. And we can't know these things for sure, right? Because this is getting into the, you know, intimate details of the experience of his consciousness. But, you know, Venus retrograde combined with the fact that it's in conjunct Saturn, that green line to Saturn in the 12th house, would suggest that there is a real struggle with self-esteem in the early life. And I think that that actually makes a lot of sense based on some of the facts of his life. His parents were divorced when he was 5. And he actually hasn't been in contact with his father since he was 7 years old. And part of the reason why that is the case is the separation was due to domestic violence. And so that is really explicitly called out in the chart here, actually, because this in conjunction between Saturn and Venus, there's a wound and affliction to the self-esteem caused by male figures. Saturn typically is associated with the father in the chart. And it's also in conjunct Mars, which is violence, it is fighting, it is conflict in the 7th house of partnership, which in this case, when you look at the early life, is going to represent his parents' partnership. And so Scorpio, where Mars is situated, obviously has to do with concepts of abuse and all kinds of manipulation. Saturn being in Aries is another indication of conflict and violence in the home, frustrating anger, all sorts of things like that. And then in conjunction to his ruling planet, which represents him in his natal chart, says that this is a formative life experience. In the 5th house, that tells us a lot more though, because the 5th house is Leo's house in the native zodiac, which is the house of entertainment. It is the house of show business, quite literally. And of course, he is a Leo sun. So he's a Leo sun in the 4th house conjunct Jupiter, Jupiter expanding on that energy and bringing a great deal of good luck and good fortune when it comes to Leo themes, being in the spotlight. That's exactly what we have with Joe, obviously, for the majority of his life. He has been in the public eye in that way, in an entertainment capacity. Jupiter in his chart as a Taurus rising represents both the areas of the 8th house with Sagittarius and the 11th house with Pisces, because of Jupiter's association to Pisces before the discovery of the modern planets. Crazy here, but it's pretty explicit because what he is known for doing out in the world is connecting with massive networks. That's the 11th house, right? He's got far reach from the beginning of his career to the end. Pisces is like film and all types of TV entertainment, and the 8th house is like taboo topics, right? So fear factor, right? Like the 8th house is literally fear and off the wall kind of taboo topics. And so he still does that very much so today when he's talking on his podcasts. You know, he covers every topic far and wide. So you can see how that energy has really manifested over the course of his life, you know, in Fear Factor, as a comedian, and now as a podcaster. So Sun in Leo is really obvious to him. He's also got, a conjunction of 3 planets, a stellium in the 5th house. So that just increases the energy of his ability to entertain, right? That's what the 5th house is all about. So his career is ruled and governed by Aquarius. That's the 10th house in the midheaven in Aquarius. And 2 rulers for Aquarius in modern astrology when we're looking, in traditional astrology. We've got Uranus and Saturn. Both of those planets are associated with the energy of Aquarius. So when I look to those placements in his chart, again, that's where you find Uranus in the 5th house of entertainment conjunct Pluto, which means massive power, massive power. And Saturn in the 12th house, Aries. Well, Aries is, again, all of that martial arts and this really brings out the element of his career as a UFC commentator, right? So that's how all of these things are related and they show up in the chart. Aquarius, of course, is I'm going to do it my way and I'm going to do it independently and I'm going to do it the way that I think is best and it's going to look different than everybody else and it's going to be my own and you can't tell me what to do. And I think he's persistently done that. It's about free thinking. It's about original ideas, exploration of ideas and the exchange of ideas and the consideration of how we can move society forward through usually pretty off-the-wall topics. And he talks about that very often when it comes to things like psychedelics and the origin of these substances in human history. He talks about, ancient civilizations and anything and everything, right? That's what he's most known for on the podcast. And those are all very Aquarian themes. He often talks about technology on there as well. So all of that makes a lot of sense. So it's an air sign, of course, so that's all about ideas and conversation. What's really interesting about this is because his podcast actually launched in 2009, and I looked up the exact date for this, and it was mind-blowing to see. December 24th, 2009. On this day, exactly, Jupiter and Neptune were conjunct at 24 degrees Aquarius. Jupiter and Neptune were conjunct in his sign of Aquarius, the house of career. Jupiter is the harbinger of good fortune and expansion. It rules, again, that 8th house, taboo topics, working with other people, getting investments to start something up, investing into something big. Conjunct his sun is deeply related to his purpose as an entertainer, as someone who's out in the spotlight. And then Neptune having to do with the 11th house of social networks and expanded reach. Those 2 planets conjunct in his 10th house of career lay the foundation for something that would later be monumental and huge and unite people all over the world through technology, Aquarius. So really interesting to see that in 2020, the podcast was taken over by Spotify for his record-breaking deal. It was like $100 million to move his podcast onto Spotify. That happened December 16th of 2020, and it hit the public news around May of 2021. And so that's really interesting because the timing is corresponding exactly to when Saturn entered Aquarius. And so that entire time is when what he started when Jupiter and Neptune were there 11 years ago comes to maturation, right? Saturn brings maturation of something that we've been working tirelessly at and putting the time in. If we've really worked with discipline on something, it matures when you experience a Saturn transit. So in the earliest degrees of Saturn in Aquarius, when it was hitting his midheaven directly, is when that podcast deal was done. So what's happening today with Joe Rogan? He's been in the news a lot for controversy. It's been challenging for him. I imagine a lot of people are upset. A lot of people are in support of him. I'm not here to talk about what's right or wrong with that. I'm here to tell you the astrology behind what's going on. So, you know, of course, Saturn brings maturation, but it also brings challenge and hardship. And it's been making a square the entire past year to Uranus, which is in his first house as a Taurus rising. And so this is a conflict between his values, his morals, his philosophies, his way of doing things, because Taurus is values, and Saturn in Aquarius is saying, well, you have to be concerned with the public good and the humanitarian good and the good of all people, because Aquarius is about how can we take care of all people? What is the best way to take care of all people? It's that humanitarian side of Aquarius energy. It's the conflict over science and rational ideas and who's right, who's wrong, and the fighting of the logical mind. And so it's causing a lot of conflict in the career. And so much of this has to do not just with values and what's right or wrong, but it also has to do with the trines happening between Uranus and all the planets in Capricorn right now, because Capricorn is in his 9th house of beliefs. It's the information that he shares out in the world in a teaching capacity, and the people that he brings onto his show that teach the world at large about these things. It's a conflict over conservative values and traditional values. That's what Capricorn is all about. And with Venus, again, Venus is his ruling planet, and it's also the ruler of his 6th house, which governs the people that you work with and the projects that you do and your colleagues. So there's all types of conflict there because it's conjunct Mars, you know, this entire period, Mars having to do with conflict and aggression and fighting. And it also has to do with, in his case, contracts and agreements, because it's the ruler of his 7th house in traditional astrology, Scorpio. So if you look at 7th house themes, this is conflict and fighting and abuse and manipulation of contracts. Now, I'm assuming he's having all of this trouble with Spotify right now. He's having to take down some of the podcasts. There's all this kind of manipulation going on here, and there is some kind of challenge going on, right, with contracts that is manifesting as a result of conflicts over beliefs and values that you're sharing out in the world and how it has an impact on the broader scope of humanity. And, you know, what's the difference between liberal, forward, innovative thinking and traditional conservative thought, right? So all of that is going on in his chart today. And then if you take it and you look at it from the perspective of Leo, by putting Leo on the 1st house, all of this energy is affecting his career even more directly. And it's really hitting the fixed sign so hard. So big year, right? So as a Taurus rising, he has Saturn in the 10th house of career. That's uncomfortable. But as a Leo sun, Uranus is really activating his 10th house, and Saturn is in the 7th house of contracts and deals and negotiations. So challenges with that, a lot of hard work going into that, a lot of issues of who's responsible for what and having it disrupt the plans in the career. So it's it's a very direct expression of that energy when you take it from the perspective of Leo as well. And then of course that Capricorn stellium would be hitting the 3rd house from the perspective of Leo, which is media, and it would literally rule podcasts. So it's a doozy of a time period for Joe Rogan in the astrology, and I do expect all of this to clear up in a couple months, particularly once this stellium of planets here, of the inner planets, especially, you know, because Mercury's been hitting Pluto. But once all of that clears, makes its way past Aquarius into Pisces, some of this should soften. So by summertime, it will all blow over. But certainly there is some trouble afoot, again, with the Saturn-Uranus square, as there has been for, you know, the past year and a half now. So that's what's up with Joe Rogan's chart. I thought it was really interesting. I'm going to continue this series. I'm thinking of calling it Star Charts. So let me know if you enjoyed this video and who you'd like to see the natal chart for next. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.